Good afternoon, everybody. This is the audience participation part. Thank you. Well, happy April Fool's Day, but I can assure you we are not fooling you with today's presentation. This is the real thing, and it's going to be very exciting. So we're thrilled to have all of you here for this installment of the Madison Vision Series. How many of you are at one of these events for the first time? Anybody? Very good. Well, welcome. Glad to have you with us. So as most of you know, the Madison Vision Series provides an opportunity for our community to explore major public issues of our time. We hope to stimulate thought, discussion, and action with a variety of speakers, perspectives, and disciplines, which brings us, of course, to our topic today. In an era where science is often undervalued and even under attack in the public square, perhaps no area requires thoughtful debate and reflection more than the future of science education and scientific discovery. Luckily, we have a national leader with us today who can speak to these issues. Dr. Barbara Schaal, whom you'll meet in a moment, is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. She is also the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, she's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Mary Dell Chilton Distinguished Professor at WashU. She was born, and I thought this was interesting, in Berlin, Germany. Is that right, Barbara? And grew up in Chicago, Illinois. She has degrees from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Yale University. Dr. Schaal is a plant evolutionary biologist who uses DNA sequences to understand evolutionary processes. And as a quick aside, I actually just got back from a trip to Ecuador, and some of you may know part of Ecuador is the Galapagos Islands, where we were for a couple of days. So certainly learning about evolution firsthand, and I know, Barbara, you said you had been there as well. What a tremendous opportunity, and we're hoping to develop some JMU partnerships and study abroad opportunities in that part of the world. So Barbara has been president of the Botanical Society of America, which apparently has its own lingo, you said, their own language, right, Barbara? Lots of big words. The Society for the Study of Evolution, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, where she served as vice president for 8 years. Dr. Schaal was appointed as a U.S. Science Envoy by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and was a member of President Obama's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology from 2009 to 2017. Today, Dr. Schaal will discuss the role science can play in improving the human condition and why each of us has a responsibility to advocate for the support of the sciences. Our nation has thrived in large part because of scientific research, breakthroughs, and applications in every phase of life. So the stakes are high when science itself is under siege, and all of us as engaged citizens have a role to play in this important public dialogue. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Schaal to the podium and to James Madison University.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin what I want to talk about, I just wanted to say how great it has been coming here. I got to meet with a lot of students this morning. I was in a classroom, which was really fun, and we had a lot of engaging conversations. I've also been tremendously impressed by some of the undergraduate programs here where you mix science and political science. That is really, I think, at the forefront of undergraduate education. So it's been a great visit, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is science and how it's important to serve society and some of the wrinkles about how that actually happens. The bottom line, the whole point of my talk is basically that science needs to serve society and that we also need to have other disciplines involved in it, that science as a public endeavor needs to have not only science, but also the social sciences and also the humanities. And I particularly want to make a point for the humanities. And in sort of a very large way, this is a call for a liberal arts education and bringing that liberal arts education into the discussions of science. So before we begin, really, I just want to provide a definition of science, so at least we know what we're talking about. Science is the study of the physical and the natural world by experimentation and observation. So it's really looking at what is the natural world. What science is not is other ways of knowing, and other ways of knowing are such things as culture, as love, as faith, religious faith. These are different kinds of human endeavor. Science is with the natural world, and that's its focus. Back in the 1600s and the 1700s, we had the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment was a goal to understand the natural world for the betterment of humankind. So to understand the world as we see it, as we feel it, as we touch it. It used to be that before the Enlightenment that there was supernatural explanations for everything. You got a disease. You got a disease because there was bad air or a bad spirit. And we now know that you get a disease very often because of microbes, bacteria, and viruses. And so this was how science was viewed and how understanding the natural world was viewed, is to make things better for humankind. So the question is, how has science done? Has it in fact been a public good, and has it provided benefits for humankind? Well, of course it has. We have such things as medicine, all of the tremendous advances in medicine, agriculture, the quality of our food, the amount of food. One of the things that I've heard is that we actually, if you go to a local grocery store, you're eating better than the pharaohs of Egypt. That's the advances that we've had in agriculture. And other things that we talk about, transportation and electronics and IT and AI, all of these different things. This is a picture of a laser. I like lasers. And so how has it improved human life? On the upper left, this shows you just simply the increase in corn yield in Missouri. I'm from Missouri, so we have Missouri corn here. And from 1912, the average yield was 20 bushels per acre, and now it's over 140 bushels per acre. On the top right is the death rate, the crude death rate from infectious diseases. And you can see this tremendous decline, and you can't read it, of course, but each point talks about some advent and some advance in public health. Where you see that big spike up in deaths, that's the 1912 influenza pandemic, a global pandemic that caused a tremendous increase in mortality. And then as we go further and further down, it's the first use of penicillin and the Salk vaccine. All of these are developments based on science. On the lower pictures, these are solar panels and solar and electric vehicles. Again, tremendous advance for some of the future concerns that we have. So the reason that we have science and the reason that governments support science is because of the benefits that we receive. And so a lot of your tax dollars go into supporting science. You can see that this is the amount in billions used for both applied and basic research. The United States leads the world at this point. The blue line is the European Union, and then the yellow line that's going up on a very steep slope, that's the amount of investment in science in China. And so governments do this, taxpayers do this in order to reap the benefits of science. And so that's one of the things we want to do, is increase benefits. So how can we do this? How can we get better things for us? When we have a technologically based society, that creates new jobs. It also creates opportunities. It gives us political stability in many cases. And these are just some of the advances of things that have happened because of science. Science is, in fact, a very large ecosystem. The beginning of that ecosystem is discovery and basic research, and that's what I want to talk about for a moment. It then goes into applied research and then ultimately product development and production. This valley of death is kind of the loss of funding and expertise that occurs between the basic research that's done primarily in universities and in laboratories versus the business community. But let's focus really on the beginning of this ecosystem, the basic research, which is done in universities and labs. So this is research that has no goal except to understand the world. It has no goal. It's not directed towards any particular goal. Another term for it is curiosity-driven. People just want to know about stuff. Why do things work the way they do? Why is the sky blue? Why are the Blue Ridge Mountains blue? Those kinds of questions. It replies on prior work, often in many different areas, and it is the basic for all applied research. This is a picture of Vannevar Bush. He was the first director of the National Science Foundation, and after World War II, President Roosevelt had, during World War II, there was this huge apparatus for defense-related research. And after World War II, President Roosevelt wondered about, well, should we just continue this kind of applied research? And Vannevar Bush very wisely said, no, in order to keep this ecosystem going, we need to feed information at the very beginning. We need to have discoveries at the very beginning so that we can develop new technologies, new unimaginable technologies, and new benefits. So fundamental research, looking at molecular structures, astronomy, how do bacteria grow, what's light composed of, all of these are questions that people have investigated simply to understand, not particularly to provide new developments, but to understand. So the real challenge of basic research, since it is driven by curiosity and the desire to know, is that when there's a discovery, you have no idea what that discovery could lead to. You can't predict the utility of a specific research project. So if you are a government and you want to expand the technological developments, the new products, all of the economic benefits of technology and research, you have to have a very large research enterprise because of this lack of predictability. And the other challenge is that it may take an extremely long time before the utility of something is discovered. This is a picture of a burr, a cockle burr, and it led to the discovery of Velcro, which is something that all of us use. So if you probably can't see it, but the end of each one of these little projections is a hook. And what that hook does is it hooks onto animal fur, and then the seed is dispersed. So the basic science was, why do burrs have hooks on the end of their little thorn-like things? And it was to disperse. Well, why do seeds want to be dispersed, et cetera? There was a whole understanding of what plants do, and then it led to Velcro. Again, when people were talking about the value of dispersal, nobody thought about Velcro. They thought about dispersing seeds to new areas and reproducing plants. So I want to give you an example of both sort of aspects about how it's not possible to predict the utility of a specific research project and also the amount of time that it might take. So this is a picture of Albert Einstein. And of course, what he is so famous for is the theory of relativity, the space-time continuum, really theoretical papers put out in 1916. And actually, it's very hard to imagine a use for relativity in our day-to-day world. So I guess, show of hands, how many of you used your GPS this last week? Yeah, it should be just about everybody, right? I mean, that's how we get around. That's how you walk around even within cities. So what GPS works on, and I'll get back to Einstein in a moment, what GPS works on is a very simple concept, and that is triangulation. This is a picture of Sir Isaac Newton. He's responsible for a lot of the first classical mechanics, for basically, if you will, discovering gravity. He was involved in this, in developing calculus. And we talk about us on Earth living in a Newtonian world. And in a Newtonian world, this is how we locate an object. This is how your GPS locates where you are. And they're really accurate. They could say right where you are in this room. And so it's triangulation. You have 3 points, and you want to locate an object, and what you do is you draw a circle at a known distance from your point, and where it intersects the object in all 3, that's the location of the object. It's well known, used all over the place for estimating location. What GPS does is it uses satellites, and it has exactly the same principle of triangulation. But instead of just using 3 points, it uses multiple points so that you become very accurate, so you can get really accurate locations. And what is used to measure distance is not obviously the actual numerical measuring in terms of meters the distance, but rather it uses as a proxy a light signal. And so a signal is sent from a GPS unit to a satellite and back, and that signal goes at the speed of light, and that converts then, if you can measure that, the time that the light takes to make that transfer over that distance, you can then calculate the distance. But in order to really do that and to do it accurately, you have to have two major developments. And both of these developments are based on basic science. And the first is we need a really, really good clock. And that clock is the strontium lattice clock. And what this does, this is really cool. It takes strontium atoms, the element strontium, and it puts them in a lattice work of a red laser. And strontium likes red. It excites the molecules, and they begin to vibrate. And it's, in some cases, it used to be supercooled. Now it's not even supercooled. They're put in a lattice so they don't interfere with each other. So, just strontium, strontium, strontium. They're excited by the laser, and they beat at a time of 430 trillion beats per second. It's actually a quantum clock. Instead of being a particulate, it becomes wave-like, but that's a little different. So we have this incredibly accurate clock that can measure really precisely the speed going up and back from these satellites. This clock is so precise that it can measure differences in gravity. Gravity, I'll talk about in just a moment. If you move something 2 centimeters up, it can detect differences in gravity. So if you were to spend your life on top of a mountain, you would live a little bit longer, maybe like a nanosecond longer than if you lived at sea level. Not something to plan your house purchase on. So we have the accurate clock now. When we start thinking about GPS, in fact, we make a transfer. We're no longer in the world of Isaac Newton. We're not in a Newtonian world. We're in the world of Einstein's quantum world. And there we have two things going on that we have to correct for. And in fact, we have to use Einstein's theories to correct for this. The first is that velocity distorts the time-space continuum. If you go really fast, time slows down. So moving fast means you have a much slower clock, not a lot slower, but in the world of relativity you do. And this is an example of really the phenomenon. So this is obviously a wind turbine. And if you think about a wind turbine, it's the axis is turning around really slowly, like this, very slowly. But at the same time, you've got the edge of the wind turbine and the tip of the wind turbine, and it's turning like this. So at the same amount of time, it's making a quarter of a turn or a complete turn, but it's covering a much greater area, and that gives it a much faster velocity. And that's what happens. We have to correct for this when we think about our clock measuring the distance. Moreover, there's a relationship to gravity as well. There's a distortion in the time-space continuum due to gravity. And we have different gravities based on whether you are at the center of the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, or if you're a satellite way out there. And so that is also a distortion. And gravity, in fact, speeds up the clock. So we have, at this point, these are the estimations of gravity on the surface of the Earth and what gravity is on the satellites that are way up in space. So again, we have to, again, correct for gravity. And what we end up doing is correcting this. This is obviously not a real picture. The satellites are not that big, but there are multiple satellites, and they have to be corrected for the relative distortion due to gravity and the relative distortion due to velocity. And it turns out, if you look at the error of a GPS system, it would be up to 10 kilometers a day if we did not correct for Einstein's relativity. So this is a case where there was a scientific discovery. It seemed extraordinarily esoteric, And it's something that we use every day, and it's something that has provided us with a great deal of information and a whole series of technologies and advances based, and an increase in quality of life. I don't get lost so much anymore based on these discoveries. What I want to talk about next is a chain of discoveries that have potentially huge, that have huge benefits, but they also begin to bring in very strong social issues. And they began with a trip to Yellowstone Park. And so this is the well-known hot springs in Yellowstone Park. And what you see are these different colored bacterial mats. Now, one of the things that we know is that if life gets heated up too much, what happens is that your proteins denature, they come apart, and the biochemical processes no longer can function, i.e. organisms die when they get heated too much. And so this is a classic case of probably a lot of people are walking through Yellowstone Park and they find out that there's living things in that water, and you wonder, well, how on earth can that survive? How can life survive in those hot springs? It's a totally reasonable question, probably not an unusual one at all. This was asked by scientists, and they had the ability to actually pursue that question. And what they discovered was that these bacteria have a whole series of enzymes that are heat stable, that they don't denature, they don't come apart when they're heated up to a particular temperature. That led to the development of polymerase chain reaction. And what this has been used for is a DNA polymerase, and this is the enzyme that will allow DNA to replicate. And so by using cycles of heating and cooling, it's able to you can take a single strand of, you can take some DNA and you can replicate it to many, many, many copies. It's an early application for molecular biology, and it was extraordinarily important. It led to DNA sequencing. So all the work that's done now on precision medicine, sequencing cancers, particular tumors, and developing therapies for that. You can't do that without DNA sequencing, which was originally done with this enzyme from this microbe from Yellowstone Hot Springs. All of genomics, so medicine and agriculture, genetic modification, a lot of what we know about the molecular processes really have been developed because we've had this incredibly important tool. So this was the first development. The second one, again from just an observation, the second one was from some microbiologists, and they were looking at the genome of a disease-causing organism, Streptococcus. You know, we all talk about strep throat. And what they found was really, really interesting, that when you sequence the genome, the DNA of a bacterium, they found this really weird stuff on the inside, that bacteria are challenged by viruses. So the kind of viruses will come into a bacteria, take over the machinery, et cetera. And what they found was in the genome, in the genes of the bacteria, there would be these little snippets of various different virus genomes. And that's really weird. Why would you, and this was the curiosity-driven question, why would you have these little snippets of virus genome in a bacterial, in the bacterial genes? And so what somebody postulated, well, maybe this is like some kind of a defense mechanism. Maybe the fact that you have a little bit of a virus genome allows that bacteria to, next time it encounters that virus, to do something. And it turned out that's actually right, that this little bit of virus genome in the bacteria, when the bacterial cell discovers another virus with the same sequence, it cuts the DNA. Bam. And that stops the virus from infecting. But this was very interesting, but it led to the aha moment. Maybe we could use this detection of a very specific sequence, a short sequence, and the ability to cut that to edit genomes, to edit genes. And that's, in fact, where we are. And this is the infamous gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9. For those of you that are just dying to know, what CRISPR means is clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats, CRISPR. And this is just an artist's conception of how this works. So this whole machinery now has been put into test tubes. It's really simple stuff to do. When you get Science Magazine, there's all these inserts by CRISPR stuff from us, lots of advertisements, and you can do it you can probably do it in your garage. So it's been an important development. It's a development that has tremendous potential for human health, for cancer therapy. This is a picture right here, the two cattle, of cattle without any horns. That was CRISPR modification. These are mushrooms that don't brown, CRISPR modification, and then the corn there, this nice white corn, that's been a starch-producing gene that's been altered to give us a commercially more relevant product from the corn. So agriculture, potential for biofuels, for bacterial products of all sorts, and synthetic biology. But there's also another aspect to CRISPR, and this is one that's been in the news, of course, and that is the potential for gene editing of humans. The potential to modify humans, their genes, and the genes, and to modify those embryos, for example, so that modification is passed on from one generation to another. So we have some questions about maybe GMOs and gene editing, but when we get to the point of modifying humans, then we really are no longer, there's a science there, but we're beyond science at this point. What we're thinking about is the humanities. What is the ethics of this? What is the philosophy behind this? Do we have policies on this? Is it something that we can control? It's a slippery slope. An initial idea was to take a developing embryo, a baby, very young embryo, and for example, if that child had a genetic disease, fixing that genetic disease. And that's a therapy that I think many people are very interested in, because in some of these things, it's a life of ill health, shorter in lifespan, and that can be fixed. And some of these genetic diseases are heartbreaking, totally heartbreaking. But you could also take it like this illustration, and in essence have, if you had enough money, you could be sure that your offspring had a high IQ, that were able to be athletes, reduce all kinds of disease, no glasses needed, etc. And so this is a real ethical kind of landscape that really requires a lot of thought. And this has been brought to the forefront because of a series of studies done by a Professor He in China, where there were two parents. They were HIV positive, and they desperately wanted to have children. So he genetically edited a series of embryos to produce a variant a variant that would convey some resistance to HIV. There were a whole series of ethical lapses in this. I mean, we could talk about that if somebody wants to ask later on, but it was just really a problematic from the get-go, coercion and all kinds of different things. That really brought this issue to the forefront. There's also differences, and here it's important to think about differences in policy. And one of the things that we see, there's different legal landscapes for you can see at the bottom it says Springer nature is neutral about jurisdiction claims in maps. That's because there's all these political issues. It's also neutral about some of these issues. So the United States and the United Kingdom have intermediate levels of permissiveness on these kinds of studies. Very permissive, China and Mexico, and very restrictive is a lot of Europe and Brazil and Australia. So there's just policies difference about how this is regulated. But the input to this is our culture, our religious beliefs, our feeling about ethics, our ideas about morality. And that's the input to this. The science tends to be neutral on it. It's we as people that put these kinds of values on it. And I want to be really clear, it's really important that we do that. That's our job as a society, is to put value and to add ethics to any kind of human endeavor. So There's been attempts at that. These are there's a lot of work on ethics in science. What is ethical conduct? That means such things as don't plagiarize, give due accreditation to other ideas, to make sure that people don't fabricate scientific results. There's also concern about doing global science and harmonizing across the globe a general consensus about what's ethical and what is the correct conduct of science. And in particular, we're worried about humans and how humans are treated. And there's been some really egregious things in the past. Many of you are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is when African-American men were infected purposefully with syphilis, and then were monitored for the course of the disease. Penicillin was discovered at the time that this was going on, and was denied to these individuals. They were not treated, even though there had been a development of a cure. And it's one of the really dark, I would say evil aspects of what has gone on in the past. President Clinton actually was the first one to issue a formal apology. Another one was a Stanford prison experiment, and this was an experiment to look at the relationship between prisoners and the guards. And so at Stanford, they took two groups of students, one were the guards and one were the prisoners, and then they just had them interact. Very quickly, the guards became so draconian that they had to stop the experiment because it was traumatizing the, quote, students that were prisoners. So in all of these cases, we're using humans as subjects and not giving them their rights and due treatment. And so we're very clear on that. But in other areas now, particularly with some of the cloning things, it's less clear. And there's a whole bunch of kinds of studies where, in fact, we need to have the input of our society, such things as genetically modified foods. And so we've got a whole lot of these different sorts of societal issues. But in many cases, for example, for cloning, doing a Stanford experiment, the Tuskegee experiment, and I think for many of us, cloning, genetically editing babies for various characteristics is something that we abhor. But there's other kinds of aspects of science where there's really a debate about them, and the policy that we have is really being buffered by different opinions. And so there's lots of different opinions, at least politically, about climate change. Many of you are probably interested in genetically modified foods. We've heard about measles outbreaks and the anti-vax group, production of energy, petroleum versus renewables. Immigration, in the 20s, many of our immigration laws into the United States were based on racial ideas that we have subsequently proven incorrect. Nuclear arms and toxicology and pollution, infectious diseases, et cetera. All of these things have a basic science component, but they're also things that our society wrestles with, and the public and the science community have different ideas about them. So a good example is climate change. This is a picture of, we're missing a picture. That's okay. This is just pictures of the extremes of climate change. At top is drought, and then the bottom one is Hurricane Harvey, which occurred in 2017, just a few years ago. And this is the Houston area, has the record for the highest rainfall, over 60 inches of rain over the episode of Hurricane Harvey. And so climate change and the causes of climate change are something that we have very different opinions on. And one of the interesting things, there it is, we don't need to worry about it, is facts versus opinion. And so these are some studies, these are multiple studies about the scientific community and whether there's scientific agreement on human-caused global warming. These are done at different times, and so they have different, and it's a repeat experiment, so you get variance. It's estimated now that about 98% of scientists, in fact, agree with the concept that the climate is changing and that it is human-caused. When we look at the public, we see sort of the same thing. You can't read this, so don't worry, even try. But what it is looking at gender differences in views about understanding global warming and lots of different questions. Is global warming happening? 70 or 71%, 70% of men and 71% of women think it is. What's interesting, the highest value of this, remember the scientists are 97%, the highest value here goes up into the 80s. 84 and 85% believe that we should fund renewable energy research. Is global warming going to harm me personally? That's less than half of the people surveyed think it's going to happen to them. They do, and they also don't believe that it's happening, it's harming the United States. But it is harming other countries. So there's this tendency to think we're okay, but the rest of you have got a problem. Again, big difference between what the public thinks and what the scientists think. But it's in the same direction. It doesn't necessarily happen all the time. We can look, and I love this slide, at genetically modified foods. So this is Hungry Man Frankenfood. You will notice that there's fingers sticking out of the baked potato, which has real eyes, human eyes, not potato eyes. There's a tail coming out of a fish tail coming out of the tomato, and the broccoli has snail in it. So this is the kind of communication that you see, and this is what I would call pretty much fake news. But it certainly grabs you. If you were in the grocery store and saw this, you certainly wouldn't take it. So there were lots of concerns expressed about genetically modified food. And some of those concerns many of those concerns came not from, if you will, being volatile, but were really honest, deep concerns. And this led to very deep investigation of these issues. So looking at you can see the safety of genetically engineered foods, genetically engineered crops, the ecological aspects of it, the environmental effects, public engagement. So lots and lots of studies. And predominantly, there was a strong sense from the scientific community that many of those concerns, in fact, were not justified, that there was no scientific evidence for particularly harm from genetically engineered foods. The environmental issue is a little more complicated, and I'm happy to talk about that. So we've got the public, on one hand, thinking that, in fact, these things are extremely harmful, and the scientific community thinking about another. So this is a survey about do scientists have a clear understanding of genetically modified crops? And the highest value is 38%. So even though the scientific community has a very strong consensus on this, the American public has exactly the opposite feeling, that scientists don't know about genetically modified foods. So it's a case where, again, we have this disconnect in a very different direction between what the public understands and what scientists understand. So we're left with this conversation about, is something fact versus faked? And it's really complicated. It's a very, very complicated landscape. You can see that that the basic science, part of the problem is just the communication of science, that we have I think some very complicated issues. The science that underlies a lot of these things is really complicated. So how you do you edit something genetically, whether or not there's environmental harm associated with genetically modified crops. These are all complicated things. And layered on top of that are the human values that we have. And one thing I want to say is, particularly with the GMOs, I've done a lot of work on that. And there are there's a lot of people that inherently feel that there is something wrong, it's a violation of nature to mix genomes of different organisms, that it is somehow unnatural and something that should be avoided. There's other people that feel that the kind of genetic modification and the whole industrialization of agriculture, which is really spurred by the kinds of crops and having to buy the seeds from particular countries, these are global international countries, that control of agriculture is something to be is something to be worried about. And these are all things, particularly the issues of faith and how you feel about nature. We have to be really careful to respect that, because these are people's beliefs. And again, this impinges on science, but it's a different way of knowing and understanding things. And we need to be careful about that. The issues about agriculture and in the global society, those are questions for economists. Those are questions for people that deal with international relationships, but they're also societal questions. And so I don't want to just discount, all the people that are worried about genetically modified agriculture, because it has many, many aspects to it. And moreover, even with some of the health issues, some of the very early studies did stuff that was really stupid, where you engineered, the idea was to enhance the protein of some food by putting in a protein from Brazil nuts into soybeans. Well, people are allergic to Brazil nuts, and so that was obviously stopped. But I want to be clear, the science suggests, has not ever shown any negative health effects, but it's an issue that needed to be addressed. And then on top of all of this, when we have something like climate change, it's not just human values, and it's not just whether or not you believe science, but there's also, of course, a driving political and an economic issue as well. And so climate change is something that suggests that we need some regulations, perhaps carbon taxes, and those are things that are anathema to some of the political kinds of support that might be used to deal with climate change. And so there's just a lot of controversy. So how can we fix this? Well, we can communicate better. We can communicate a lot better. So communicating science, we've had lots of conversations this morning about communicating science. So the way that scientists have in the past communicated is if you're explaining what you do. First place, if you're at a cocktail party and somebody walks up to you and says, "What do you do?" and you say, "I'm a scientist." Well, they run away or something. And if they have enough fortitude, they might ask what you do, and so you explain, and then they don't get it. So how do you respond to that? By not understanding? Not an unusual way of responding is to say what you wanted to say louder and, of course, in more detail, so thereby making sure that nobody understands what you're talking about. That needs to be fixed, and people are working on it. Likewise, we have a new thing. You may not be able to read this, but here's some poor guy doing this huge mathematical study and coming up with some conclusion, and this guy says, "Nuh-uh," some guy just on Twitter said you were wrong. And so we have this other kind of aspect about the viral kind of social media and the lack of validation of particular ideas. And so there's some real challenges with science communication, and some of them, I think particularly with social media, that were hard to imagine probably 15 years ago. So how do we communicate? The first way you communicate is respectfully to the people that you're talking to, and understanding that if somebody is asking you about a scientific issue or to explain yourself, that they deserve a response. They're probably thinking about things, which is just wonderful if they actually have questions. There's also a lot of work being done about how we actually communicate, the science of science communication. And this uses social science work, and it tries to understand how we can change people's ideas, how we perceive data based on our own beliefs. And there's a lot of really important aspects of this that have come out. One of the concerns that many scientists have, and the reason that they don't want to communicate, is because they feel that they lack fidelity to their field. In order to really tell you what they're doing, you have to explain it in detail. It turns out you can get the concept across without going into the incredible detail, which is guaranteed to lose anybody who isn't in your own field. So there's a lot of work about how to do this in an appropriate and respectful way. Education, of course, is probably the ultimate aspect to this, that we need to have a society where people value science, they value the science for the benefits that it produces, and which allows us to really look at facts and to understand what our state of knowledge is, as opposed to opinion based on politics or other sorts of things. So the goal of all of this, the goal of communication, The goal of public understanding of science is for the public to understand science, not only to support science and to keep the enterprise going, but more, I mean, the one that I really get, that really gets me is the ability to use facts in decisions. We've seen now that there's this anti-vaccine movement. And this to me is particularly painful because it's sort of a philosophical issue. The science is very clear, and when it's not adhered to, when the physician's recommendations aren't adhered to, the victim of this, the people who suffer are children and who get measles and a number of, and all of these other kind of communicable diseases. So it's really important for us in education to make sure that people use facts in decisions on their own lives. It's important for government policies. And again, all of this is going back as kind of hokey, build a better world, but that's what the Enlightenment wanted. This is where we started out, was to use science and to understand the natural world for the betterment of humankind. And that's what we're trying to do here. And to do it in a way where we take into consideration not only the scientific values, but all of the things that we hold so dear, our culture, our beliefs, and our ethics. So with that, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to do Q&A. We've got a couple folks that are going to have roving microphones. So if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
What characteristic of human nature do you think accounts for the difference in trust in scientists on global warming versus the distrust of scientists on GMOs?
Let me be honest, I don't know, but I can speculate, and I speculate as not an expert on these things. Climate change is something that's a little bit remote. I mean, you see that in the surveys, that if you ask the American public, is it going to affect you or your country, they say no, it's going to affect somebody else. It's very hard to detect climate change. So we have a gradual increase in temperature, but around that increase is lots and lots of variation. One year it's hot, one year it's cold, next year it's cold. So it's not something that we perceive, it seems remote. With genetically modified foods, we all eat every day. And so if you know that if you go out and you don't pay attention, you will be consuming this. And so it's much more, it's much more real in some sense. But I think there's other things involved as well. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of groups that have very strong campaigns, either for or against genetically modified foods, also climate change. But I don't know. My speculation is it's how closely it seems to affect individuals. I'd love to hear if anybody else has any idea on that. That would be really interesting.
I think it's learned behavior.
You think it's learned?
No, herd. It's kind of
Oh, I see. Yeah, herd.
tribal. It's kind of a tribal aspect in that with social media, we've all retreated into our own little bubbles.
Yeah.
And so, like on climate change, I think at most you have global lukewarming. I think the IPCC has something like 29 climate models, and they
Right.
average them together. And when you look at the results, they overshoot the actual readings, whether it's by balloon or satellite. The Russian model apparently historically has the closest match up with the actual data. And then you've got the aspect of how good is the scientific methods that they're using if they just average 29, but don't wait for the accuracy of the Russian model in their averaging. So you have things like that going on. Most people, I think, don't know what the percentage of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, which is 0.04%. The GDP of the U.S. is 25% of the global GDP, and yet we produce 15% the global, the global warming gases. So you have like you say, the political aspect, where you have the Green New Deal and everybody dancing around, but none of the politicians will put their name on it. So I think in the end, the bad things don't happen until the conversation stops. And when you're unwilling to listen to somebody else, that's when you have retreated into your bubble and you don't have anything to offer going forward.
Well, I would agree that retreating into a bubble is a bad idea, and that social media has certainly split us more apart. But in terms of global warming, we have thermometers, and we know that the temperature has increased, and the climate models, in fact, have been wrong. And I think in terms of the expansion, the heating of the oceans, it's a little bit more than predicted. So there's a lot of variability. But looking at just mean Earth temperatures, we do see, whether it's lukewarm or hot, it's an issue.
My question is, why do you think vaccinations are so widely accepted while CRISPR has extreme pushback?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry. My question is, why do you think vaccinations are so widely accepted while CRISPR has extreme pushback, when they both are supposed to be altering the human body for the better, hopefully?
So why vaccines accepted and CRISPR now? Well, CRISPR is new technology. It hasn't been, I think one of the real pushbacks, well, one was using it on humans. We don't know at this point whether one of the criticisms is there's unintended effects. We're not sure that if you're editing one gene, it doesn't cause some change in other genes. Eventually, that will be, I think, assessed, but that's been one of the concerns, and that's one of the reasons why this experiment with the HIV resistance was so draconian. Vaccines have been around for a very, very long time, and it is just extremely wide consensus by the medical community and the scientific community that the issues that are associated with vaccination are not those that are claimed by the anti-vax people. And there are also, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, I should have specified. We're more at the start of vaccination. I understand it's been there for a while now, but I believe as a part of building CRISPR, so that eventually there would be a better consensus for it, you'd need to actually start doing experiments, not necessarily on humans, but to start to build that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what you do, this is why we have model systems. This is why we do stuff in fruit flies and worms and in rice plants and Arabidopsis, is because we don't experiment on humans. And so what you would be doing is, if you wanted to in fact, let's say the goal is to eliminate or to provide a therapy for an embryo that has a genetic a mutation that needs to be fixed, you would begin to do an analogous animal model and begin to test how effective it is, and to make sure that there's no unintended. So that's we're not at that point. And I think you'll have to do a lot of experimentation and a lot of studies before it, I think, is considered reliable in humans. The other thing with the embryo, the genetic editing of embryos, is this was done with some of it was done with misleading paperwork. It was banned. Was not permitted in China. Using patients blood from HIV patients is not allowed. The patients were told, these were, I assume, people that were very, very desperate to have children. And, that's a very human sort of thing. Yes. And so the estimated cost of this therapy was about $42,000. And these patients were told that if you wanted to pull out of it, you would have to pay all of that back. And so there was some coercion involved. I mean, it's just really messy business. And this is probably something that's going to have a negative effect.
Hello. Regarding the issue of communicating to the public, it strikes me there's two sides. two problems. I mean, one is a loss of faith, the public having a loss of faith in what science does for society, and that's happened over probably the space of the last 2 generations. And then secondly, how much does the public actually want to try and understand, or how much can we communicate an understanding of basic scientific ideas, concepts? I mean, evolution theory, just asking people in the general public what a gene is, what do they understand by that? There's sort of 2 separate issues. I mean, one, you could talk about 97% of scientists accept climate change being a product of human activity, and therefore the public should believe in the 97%, or do we want the public to actually understand how we generate these models to try and predict exactly what is happening based upon our ability to match the records in the past? And both of them bear upon the pure research, having curiosity-driven research valued and supported, because that's where we are most under attack as scientists, right? I mean, evolution theory wouldn't have existed if it had to have been funded by somebody saying this is what we're going to get out of it. The idea that most of our discussion focuses on the medical gains, the economic gains, and so on, takes away, I think, from the idea that this bigger, broader approach to science has to be valued enough by the public in order to keep our society moving forward.
So you raise a lot of really interesting points. The idea, I think there's a lack of trust of experts in general. I don't think it's just scientists. But yet when Research America does a survey of most respected professions, you get medical doctors and firefighters and scientists. So there's this odd disconnect. I think understanding the scientific issues, I think it has to start in K through 12. I mean, you have to have a citizenry that understands the value of science and what it is. I think it's really worrisome, and it's not just in science, but just in general, the kind of negation of things that we know are true. Let's just take it outside of science. If somebody walks out and says, wow, it's raining out, and somebody else says, no, it's not, actually we had that. We did. That was the inauguration. That was a bad example. Let me try something else. The sky is blue, and somebody else says, no, it's actually purple. And you have them yelling at each other. I mean, this is absurd, but that kind of not having, of being able to change what we know is reality is really deeply disconcerting, I think. And it's not just in science, it seems to be across the board. And it's exacerbated, I think, by social media. It's exacerbated by the polarization that you talked about, the herd mentality. And I think many people are really very concerned. But I think you have to have education. Otherwise, I think most people don't care about the science and what science does. I think we have.
But we have the education, right? I mean, how do we have a bigger voice? I mean, the education system is already giving the message, but we have a very shallow voice in society. So.
I think you said you have to have receivers of that message. And I think by the time people get into high school, science is viewed by many as something that's esoteric. It's for people that are really, really smart. These people are eggheads, and it doesn't seem like something that average people can want to do or could understand. There's this idea that you have to be brilliant. And of course, that's really countered when you look at these science science days for families. I know you have one here as well in the mall where there's all these opportunities for children, and they don't know that you have to be, quote, smart to be a scientist. They just know that this stuff is really fun and interesting. And so I think that we need to also work not only on the way that we communicate, but on our educational system has to really do a better job of teaching science. I still remember I went over the science standards for our daughter when she was in elementary school, and what they were teaching wasn't science. It was, at one point, you're supposed to go and hug a tree. literally hug a tree. So there's a lot of work to do.
Hello. So regarding anti-vaccine movements in the country, one interesting point is that for some older people, it would be living memory, or at least living memory of relatives, we had a polio epidemic. And before that, we had the 1918 Spanish influenza, which killed a lot of people. And to have such influential events within the cultural memory, one would hope still, and have this sort of movement spring up, it seems like people are willing to ignore well-established facts. They could ask their own parents or grandparents, did the polio epidemic happen? Yes, I remember. Did the vaccine come out and was it effective? Yes, I remember. Anecdotal evidence doesn't prove a lot, of course, but still it is within living memory, and yet we have a sort of people who seem to be purposely ignoring things that are easily established as fact.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, I was a kid during the polio epidemic, and it was a terrible time. And then all of a sudden there was a vaccine, and we all lined up in school, and there was no approval. You just lined up, and boom, you got it. And that changed a lot.
And so my question was, do you really have any sort of suggestion about how to sort of handle this readiness to deny fairly easily established facts?
I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. And I'd love to hear people's opinion on, how do we counter that?
They want to believe it. And when you want to believe something, it's very hard to change that opinion.
Well, yeah, the social science on how you change opinions would agree with you 100%. You can take a bit of data, and you can take some data, and and the data has, let's say it's GMOs are healthy, GMOs are bad, and you can actually ask a group of people that believe in GMO, and they'll look at the set of data and say, oh yeah, it supports me. And then people who are anti-GMO will look at the same data and say, oh, clearly it supports my view that they're bad for you. So yeah,
It's
exactly.
something similar is, to your point, people can tell you who's winning Dancing with the Stars, but they can't tell you the three branches of government. You have Venezuela, which is a great example of socialism failing, in real time, and yet something like 40% of 20 to 35-year-olds think that socialism is a better economic form than capitalism. How do you explain that? I mean, it doesn't get any more real than that, and yet people just totally they don't even push it aside. They don't even look at it in the first place. But they want to believe that socialism is better, therefore it is better. And I don't know how you fix that other than, Lord help us.
Right. So it seems that one of the important influences on this whole story is the sort of wholly unethical and very, I think, rationally driven approach by, say, a big corporation like Exxon or something, right, coming along and saying, look, we know what we're about. We're making a buck, right? And we are going to spin the story so that we are making a buck. And yes, it's completely unethical, therefore, what they wind up supporting and distributing as the science of climate change, right? Whether they're throwing in a little bit of doubt or whether it's just pure disinformation. As a science community, it seems like we could actually be very actively calling out such things as unethical science. I don't know if there is really such a movement, and also, I mean, you've been involved with science at the national level. Is there such a thing within the discussion of science in the government? In other words, really coming down and saying, no, this is what you have just done is an unethical thing.
That's a really interesting point, because it's very nuanced. So we don't want police looking at everything, and I mean, I just think, policing and looking at every bit of science to make sure and every claim. I mean, that's a monumental undertaking. At the same time, there are things that are so egregious that, in fact, they do fall under scrutiny. So one of the things that so there's lots of opportunities, I think, for pushback. One of the things that we see in the magazine Science, which is one of the really premier places to publish your scientific research, is the ability now to make sure that it is valid science, that in fact during peer review it's checked. See, one of the big differences between something that a corporation puts out, like Facebook, let's do something, well, I guess that's not that neutral either. Nabisco's not neutral either. Good grief. Corporation X is putting out some information, and it's predominantly true, but they twist it a little bit to make their point. That's really different than something that's completely fake that comes out. And even though the kind of twisting can be just as harmful, and how you deal with that is really, I think, a challenge. A lot of it has to do with a public that's a little bit more sophisticated. What I worry about is that people, in fact, are just listening and just paying attention to whatever group, whatever herd they're in, and not even thinking about the other. And that goes for liberals and conservatives and both sides. I mean, people need to really look at the arguments and the information. But it's a really complicated landscape. It's one that I think many of us worry about. There are ways, one of the concerns in science has been the validity of results. And when someone does something and publishes something and it in fact is then retracted, that is a huge professional liability for somebody. So that aspect of peer review and having studies replicated and building on it, science tends to correct itself. If you are putting out fake propaganda, it's much harder to correct because there's really not that kind of mechanism. Unless, and you can see with some of the when science pushes back, it's not always particularly effective.
Hi, do you think identity politics and the polarizations of political parties have negatively impacted the reputation of science? And if so, how do you think we can remove that bias?
I think there has been some hits on science. I think when it becomes politicized, then by definition it has negative effects on science. Science should just be a statement of this is what we know, and it shouldn't be political. It should just be there, and then it's the responsibility of citizens, it's the responsibility of the academic community to layer on top of that what the consequences are of that bit of information. And it's for society to say how that information is going to be used. So I think when you get at the basis of science, that's really unfortunate because lots of times it's how it's interpreted. The other thing that I really worry about is if we're thinking about 20 years from now, what's the new technologies going to be? What kind of benefits? You have no idea. There could be some biologist that's looking at some crazy plant with this funny kind of latex, and that could end up as a new source of energy. So we want to really keep that enterprise going with the understanding that it requires a lot of work with a lot of people, and not all of it is going to be beneficial. If you're for some of us, just knowing is value enough. But if you're a government, you need to invest your dollars wisely, and governments do that in order to keep these benefits flowing for the future. So I worry about science being hurt, because ultimately the spigot will be turned off.
Just to shift gears a bit here, but you led to something when you mentioned the idea of new discoveries coming along. I want to have questions about the role of intellectual property and the idea that scientists deserve to be rewarded for discoveries, but on the other hand, there's a common good to releasing the discoveries. And I wonder if you think we're right now doing the balance right on that people can, say, for instance, have patents on drug lines or new seed lines or things like that when there are lives that could be saved, or is it more appropriate for the scientist to to be able to be funded and get their work done?
That's a really tough question, and it's one that has many different nuances. One of the things that I found, again, we're dealing with people here, so I'm going to tell you me as a person, when there was this movement to try to patent DNA sequences from genes that were found in wild animals and plants. And to me, that's like not right. I mean, that to me, it's that diversity belongs to the globe, and those gene sequences belong to the global community, is sort of the way I view it. On the other hand, if you've, let's say that's from a plant and that has a useful compound. On the other hand, if you are a company and you've spent 10 years developing a drug or a seed line that requires some remuneration so you can keep the investment going and do more research. So I understand that. And those are kinds of at some ends. And then in the middle, there's all this very, I think, murky sort of ideas about intellectual property. In some cases, things that could be profitable are also licensed freely to developing countries, and I think that's a reasonable way of approaching it. This is not my area of expertise, but I think it's very hard to come up with a single answer. It really depends on what the technology is, the amount of work, and where the original source of the information came from.
Hi. Do you see any barriers to the development of science in the future where science, like you said, is a field that so desperately, because it's driven like curiosity, it's impartial, it needs funding from the outside. Do you see any difficulties in a world where wealth is becoming more and more concentrated in the hands of few, and that may seep into science and make it more partial?
One of the things that I've learned, I've taught with humanists and social scientists, and one of the things that I've learned is that while we think that science is pure and it just goes in whatever direction based on curiosity, it's actually not. It's funded very often, and this came as a course that we taught on the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was supposedly this big scientific mission to understand the people and the diversity of the American West. Well, it turned out it was an economic thing, it was a political thing, and likewise now that influences the decisions that people make in order to pursue science. I mean, I have to say, and I say this as a basic scientist, if you have a program here which has lots of money and I could twist my science to get some of that, I would do that, because we always need money to do our research. So having said that, I don't know if you get to the point, medical research, and NIH has studied the basic molecular biology and biochemistry of life. And that has paid off immensely, and that was because there was a lot of money put into that basic research. So there is this idea you need to have funds. There are whole areas of research which are not being funded. Understanding very often the relationship between different groups of organisms, taxonomy, understanding how, this old problem that Charles Darwin had, why there's so many beetles, just who's going to identify the beetles? That's not funded anymore. So there's a lot of disparities, and I think lots of things influence. I'm not sure that I answered your question.
Hi. So this question is a little bit different, and I hope you'll entertain it. So there's a lot of students here, and probably many of the things that you've done in your professional career are things that they would aspire to do. So I was wondering if you could speak just briefly about some of the things that you've done or pursued or behaviors that you've had that have brought you to the seat at a president's table to talk about science.
I had the good fortune of getting elected to the National Academy of Sciences when I was quite young, and that about a year after I was elected, I was asked if I would serve as co-chair of a standing committee to look at the health and the environmental effects of genetically modified organisms. So I got into all of this by getting elected as a basic scientist. I was elected because of the scientific publications that I had. And then I don't know why I was asked to co-chair this, because I'd never done anything like that before. And that led to, I think, a real interest in global issues and in overarching scientific issues. And so I just started to do more, and I got asked to do more and more of that. But it really began with being a basic scientist, in a laboratory with graduate students and undergraduate students, and doing teaching. I taught evolution, and I taught plants and people to non-science majors, and then that just led into this very first kind of committee. And then I just started to get asked to do a lot of that, so that was really, it was awesome.
One last question. We have time for one more, Mike. There's a hand over here.
Hello. I was just wondering, in regards to ethics, how can we balance ethics with global competition when complying to ethical regulations other nations ignore may ultimately hinder progress?
That's a really good question. I think that the one study that I showed you, the global conduct of science, that was done by the Inter-Academy Panel, which is a group of scientists that represent all of the academies of science. And so there's this movement across countries to come up with a set of standards, which is what this was, for the conduct of science. And it dealt with a lot of the ethical issues. It also dealt with biosecurity. It dealt with how we interact with people in a laboratory, understanding and making sure that we have diversity, that we don't have microaggressions, all of the things that on a global scale, that there's a lot of consensus. I think where, the gene editing in humans that happened in China, and China was horrified by this. So there's a lot of pushback in China. The person who did this was arrested. So there is a lot of progress. I think where you run into difficulties is if there are changing cultures, and the culture of science is changing within a country. If there are tremendous incentives, for example, to publish a paper in science, in the journal Science, those kinds of incentives can then lead to breaches in ethics. The vast majority of scientists are completely ethical, and one of the reasons they're ethical is because our work is always checked. If you publish something, somebody else is going to do it, and it's either going to be validated or it's going to be tossed out. And so I think there's a lot of momentum to make sure that things are done correctly, and that when you publish something, it's true. But there are differences, and we're dealing with people, and people are messy, and not everyone follows those ethics. I think there is the idea of harmonizing global standards is really important, and part of it is because I know this has happened in a case earlier where there was some editing of non-viable human embryos. The global scientific community was outraged, and the lab and the country where this was done in, they were stunned that there was this outrage. And then the people that went to kind of deal with this, representing the global science community, were stunned that they were stunned. I mean, there just needs to be this sort of harmonizing of ethics, and there's progress towards that. That doesn't mean that we're still not going to have some bumps in the road.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Barbara. So Barbara, thank you so much for being a champion for science, for educating not just students, but also the general population and the public at large about the importance of science and scientific research. You've been a tremendous and powerful voice and a passionate voice for science for quite a while now, and a real inspiration to our students and faculty. So thank you so much for being with us. We have a small token of our appreciation to commemorate your visit to James Madison University. And I just want to remind people that the Madison Vision Series will, of course, continue next year. We're working on the schedule right now. If any of you ever have suggestions for speakers, you can contact my office and send in names and possibilities. We're always looking for good ideas and for a variety of perspectives and topics. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a great evening, everybody.